flag me now when I have like 5 minutes left. Thank you. I'm excited to chat with you today on this topic of multiculturalism and IP&T. And I think one of the first questions someone might ask if they're watching right now is, why is the whitest guy in a room full of white people, or with a lot of white people in it, leading this talk? And in our culture, oftentimes we find it difficult to talk about multiculturalism. And I say this just as a white person, I'm owning that. Like, I feel awkward oftentimes talking about it. And it's not because it's not something that I don't think is important or interesting, but because I often feel like I just don't know what to say, or I don't know how to approach topics in a way that that's appropriate. And so I'm going to talk through this a little bit with you, just how kind of I have come to approach multiculturalism in my own work, some of the discomforts that I have faced in this area, and some paths forward. I'm going to start by just showing a quick video here that most of you have probably seen, produced by the church. Talk to me about your initial reactions to that and how that relates to multiculturalism, and what are some of kind of the takeaways that we should have in our work. Go ahead, Tara. Grab a mic if you can.
One of my takeaways from that is kind of just that you don't have to be the same, and it's not necessarily good. It's okay to recognize the differences and to draw attention to it and to use it. It's not like you shouldn't have to try to be like anyone else for it to be meaningful, and for people to be, I guess, respectful of that, which I don't feel like is really a problem in this department or things like that, but just in general to realize that someone else's perspective, just because they're different, doesn't mean that it's not supporting the same cause or purpose, or you can't learn from it.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts? That was beautifully stated. And I share this with you because for me, this is where multiculturalism starts. It comes down to fundamentally who I am as a child of God and who you are as a child of God. And you have value because of who you are. And that includes, as Tara pointed out, all the aspects of who you are. So for me, the big question facing us in terms of multiculturalism in our work as teachers, as designers, is first, how do I ensure that my practices value the diverse experiences and perspectives of those that I serve? And second, how can I empower all of God's children to be successful and fulfilled? So there are two aspects to multiculturalism: valuing first, and then empowering second. There are lots of potentially, like in the literature related to multiculturalism, there are lots of overlaps with other bodies of literature. And so as we start talking about multiculturalism, we might make reference to some other bodies of literature as well. But these are different topics, and so I'm just pointing this out to show that we're not going to jump into any of these specific areas today, but there is some overlap in some of the things that we're talking about. Generally, multiculturalism is understood in a pretty specific way that is focused on race, ethnicity, language, culture, and nation of origin. Again, sometimes it is used kind of more expansively to include some of the other things in the previous slide, but this is at its basis what multiculturalism includes, and recognizes that all of our learners have a diversity of experiences and backgrounds in all of these areas. If you weren't able to go to the forum here at BYU, was it last week? By Brian Stevenson. It was amazing. So your reading in preparation for today was just the Deseret News article on that. He talked about 4 principles for supporting justice. And one of his closing thoughts was that we advance justice only when we're willing to do things that are uncomfortable. Within the context of his talk, it seemed like what he was meaning by uncomfortable was specifically things that make us socially uncomfortable. So like he talks about being proximate to folks, so putting ourselves in situations that we might not otherwise find ourselves in, like on death row, so that I can be close to a death row inmate. And so there's some social discomfort that he argues is necessary that we all have to experience in order to overcome some of these challenges. But I want to talk today a little bit about what I'm calling intellectual discomforts. And I do this because, just from my own experience, as I take in lots of classes on multiculturalism and found myself in conversations with folks and listening to the things they say and reading the literature in this area, it seems like there are some areas of discomfort that don't stem necessarily from who I am, but there seems to be some fundamental kind of intellectual tensions at play with multiculturalism that we don't always address. And so I just want to address these first to kind of show you where I'm coming from and kind of how I've found my way through them. And then we'll get to talking about concrete applications in our field. And so as I think about the tensions that I face in thinking about, well, how do I go about adopting, well, first of all, I don't consider myself to be a social justice educator. I don't consider myself to be a critical race theorist. And the reason for that is that there are some fundamental differences that I have with some of the theoretical underpinnings of those traditions. But we often don't talk about those. And we tend to approach multiculturalism and issues of race and gender as well by creating binaries and saying either you're a critical race theorist or you are not, and you're the problem. You're a social justice educator. And I remember being in a teacher education program where basically they put with gifts an assignment where we had to explain why we're a social justice educator, never asking us if we saw problems with the tradition of social justice. But basically, you had to be a social justice educator. You had to buy into all the intellectual kind of traditions associated with social justice, or you were the problem. And I think that we approach these issues often in those ways. And for me as a student, it created some discomfort trying to figure out, well, if I am really trying to serve God's children and value who they are, does it mean that I have to buy into absolutely every bit of dogma associated with this tradition? Does that make sense? And so I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the tensions that I think face us. The first comes from this basic narrative that we have of racism. And it's basically that we argue that if someone has a particular intent, so a particular intent to oppress someone, for instance, then they will create social or institutional artifacts of oppression that then lead to inequity. So, simple example of this, if you are a racist landowner in the South pre-Civil War, you will create laws and enforce laws associated to keep African Americans in slavery, and then this leads to disproportionate outcomes for how people are treated. And so there's this narrative of racism leads to oppression, leads to inequity. And I think, I totally buy this. This makes perfect sense to me. If you are a racist person, you will enforce things, or you will establish artifacts that are oppressive, that will lead to inequity. The problem that we run into, though, is that we can't see inside people's hearts, and so we can't really see racism very well. We also often can't even tell if an artifact is oppressive in and of itself, whether or not a social institution is oppressive on its surface. But what we do instead is we start over here. We recognize inequity. From that, we determine whether an artifact is oppressive. And from that, we often determine that whoever constructed that artifact has some racist intent. Does that make sense? So we start on this end and go in that direction. Those of you who have taken my intro to writing class, what's the problem with that? Do you see a problem with that?
I didn't take that.
That's okay.
Well, thank you. So inequity can come as an unintended consequence as well. It's not always
Yeah.
an intended consequence.
Great. Awesome. So this is a logical structure that's created here. If this, then this. If this, then this. The problem is if you start in this direction and go in the opposite direction, it's logical fallacy. You're affirming the consequent. You're saying, because if we accept this to be true, and then we see this, then we must assume this, we must assume this. Without recognizing that there might be other reasons that this is happening, there might be other reasons that this is happening, and so forth. So in order to do this, then we have to take two logical leaps. And so, again, when I was first, introduced to multiculturalism, I got bogged down in this a lot. Because I felt like anytime you saw inequity, it could be used to say that any kind of practice is oppressive, and could be used to say that anyone is racist. I think the argument that is often used to kind of discount all of multiculturalism and all these kinds of considerations builds upon this with kind of a collateral damage metaphor, where folks might say, yes, there is inequity, but that's not the result of oppression. It's just the fact that whenever you have any kind of institution, you're going to have, it's not going to serve the needs of everybody. But let's take that metaphor all the way. Let's consider that you are a commanding officer in the military. And every day you get a report that says the number of casualties that you've sustained. And let's say your assistant one day comes to you and says, listen, General Mason, I've done the numbers and I see that 8% of our troops are African American, but they account for 20% of our casualties. As the commanding officer at that point, you kind of have a choice. You can either say, well, I'm not intentionally causing African Americans to be killed at a greater rate than all of my other troops. Or you can take a step back and say, well, what is it about my strategy that might be causing this to happen? Does that make sense? So even though this is a logical leap, it seems like it's an important step to at least consider. It's valuable if we see inequity to step back and ask, is it the effect of oppression? Is it the result of oppression or of an oppressive artifact? An example of this is very pertinent right now is like voter ID laws. So I'm talking to my 12-year-old about the value of voting, and she says, well, how do we make sure that someone doesn't get to vote twice? Why don't we create a law that people have to show ID? Like on the surface, that makes sense, right? But the argument is that, well, what if the ID that you're requiring is disproportionately used by certain groups over than others? So like if I live in an urban community and I don't need a driver's license because I never drive, then I'm less likely to have a driver's license. So if I'm relying upon a driver's license as what allows me to vote, then you can argue that yes, that leads to inequitable outcomes, so even though that artifact itself may not intentionally be oppressive, it might have an oppressive effect. Does that make sense? So I think this leap is valuable to make. I think whenever we see inequity, it's valuable, even though it takes a logical leap to do it, to ask the question of is that the effect of some kind of oppressive artifact? Now, what I don't think is very fruitful is this second leap that is often made, that when we see an oppressive artifact, like voter ID law, for instance, we assume, well, that's just because we have a bunch of racists that want to enforce their will upon the majority, or upon minority groups. Does that make sense? But we have these conversations over and over again, and we do it in academia, we do it in the literature, and I just don't see this second step as very fruitful. I think back to President Hinckley a lot whenever I think about this. He loved to quote this poem by Edwin Markham, where he said, "He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing defiled, but love and I had the wit to win, we drew a circle that took him in." Similarly, Abraham Lincoln argued that if you look for the bad in people expecting to find it, you surely will. I don't think we need to make this second leap. I think what we can do is focus on oppressive structures to try to address inequity and not really worry about this very much. Another area of tension when you look at the literature is that a lot of the literature has grown out of Marxism. And Marxism is based on the premise that all problems in the world, at least the ones that matter, ultimately boil down to class or race-based struggles between oppressors, the bourgeoisie, and the oppressed. And so it interprets all of history through this lens of class oppression. And you see this borne out in like critical race theory as well, where this same idea, the same thesis, is applied to race, that all the problems that we see in the world are the result of race, or racial tension. I think that's problematic because it's very reductionistic. If anyone comes to you and says, I can explain all the world's problems and they all boil down to this one thing, you should be critical of what that person is saying, because the world is complex. And so when we're facing problems in education, we often will rely upon a much more simplistic answer because it's easy to act upon, versus a more complex answer that actually may be more closer to the truth. And the third tension that often arises in this area is that people argue that the only solution to oppression is revolution, or a revolutionary mindset. I mean, the Marxist literature is referred to as permanent revolution, but it leads to this uncompromising view that everything that we are, all the structures that exist are inherently racist, and so they must be destroyed and built up again. I mean, just yesterday I saw this tweet from a leading thinker in our field. She said, America is so racist to its core, and you can't wish white supremacy away by hoping year after year there are still good votes to be counted. This mindset suggests that positive change cannot happen within existing structures, and existing structures need to be destroyed. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's true. But most of the, or at least much, but I think most of the literature in this area kind of assumes the same stance. Whereas I argue back, we've seen great improvements. We've seen the 13th Amendment. We've seen the Civil Rights Act. Those are innovative steps. And so when we approach issues of multiculturalism, I don't think we have to take on a revolutionary mindset. We can take an innovation mindset and build upon what already exists. The perfect example of this, I think, is the Civil War. Slavery was the clearest example, the most prominent example of racism we faced in our nation. And it was abolished. But you might argue, but there was a war. Well, why was there a war? There was a war because southern states realized, they saw the writing on the wall. They knew that slavery was going to be abolished one way or another. And rather than allowing that to happen, they broke away. So in the Civil War, the southern states were the revolutionaries. They didn't want to allow innovation to occur. And even if you look at a lot of the leaders in the South, like Stonewall Jackson, he believed that slavery, even in the South, would eventually end through innovation, and he was fighting for other reasons. He was fighting for states' rights and those kinds of things. But I'm just pointing this out because innovation was occurring even in the pre-Civil War to end racism. And to argue that, no, America just needed to throw everything out the window, just doesn't make sense. Because even this greatest artifact of racism in our history was addressed through innovation. Solzhenitsyn has this great quote that I love. He said, if only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? I think we rely upon simplistic explanations for phenomena, complex social phenomena, so that we can, which includes villainizing other people and trying to oversimplify the problems that we face, so that we don't have to face the problems in their actual complexity. Similarly, even during the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of back and forth on even what nonviolence meant at the time. And I really appreciate Gandhi's approach to nonviolence and how he defines it. He defined nonviolence as seeking to liquidate antagonisms, so those institutions, those artifacts, but not the antagonists themselves. So we can promote positive change without going after, without identifying enemies and trying to destroy enemies. Does that make sense? So those are kind of, again, kind of the tensions that I've faced when I've grappled with this literature, and kind of the stance that I've taken. I think that, and I just share that with you so you know where I'm coming from. But so I don't think that we have to, there's just some tensions there, and I think that we can work together to affect positive change, even if we don't all agree on all of the same fundamental assumptions about multiculturalism and race and change. So here are some basic principles. Anyone recognize this? What is it? That's Maslow's hierarchy. So basically it argues that we have this hierarchy of needs, and as educators, we're typically trying to address some of these higher levels of needs. We're trying to help people to learn how to problem solve, how to accept facts, how to be creative. But in order to do that, there are some more fundamental needs that we need to address. Like if a kid comes to my class and they haven't eaten in 2 days, it's going to be hard to teach them fractions. It's going to be hard for them to listen to me over their grumbling tummy. Similarly, if a student comes to my class and they don't feel safe or appreciated, or like I value them as a person, that can have similar effects. And so the goals of multiculturalism in education are really threefold. And these are kind of hierarchical. The lowest, most basic goal is equality. Above that is equity. Above that is liberation, trying to seek to liberate those who have been oppressed by artifacts and institutions. So some key words that we need to be familiar with are marginalization, othering, and stereotype. So since these may not be familiar to everyone, who can define marginalization for me? Esther, can you do it for me?
I mean, I can say something that might. So I feel like it's pretty related to othering, but marginalization means, in my mind, sort of discounting and setting them aside as having less needs or less worthy of needs or less capable.
Great.
Yeah,
So,
putting there less than.
Great, yeah. So it's this idea that there is a center and then there are the margins, and we're pushing certain people to the margins, and those margins are considered as kind of less than or less important or less deserving of emphasis. Great, thank you. And I think othering is very similar to that. Oftentimes we other people so that we can marginalize them. I lump you into this group so that I can push you to the margin. What about stereotype? This is actually a technology term. For those of us who are younger that don't realize this, but what is this? What is a stereotype?
I think basically a stereotype is taking like groups of people that might be inherently complex and then taking certain commonalities that you see, creating this example stereotype of that is intended to describe all of those people, but might not be true of all those
Great,
people.
awesome. So the stereotype was the actual machine was a predecessor to the copy machine. And so it's this idea that I'm making a copy of, I'm taking this idea that I have about this person, I'm making copies of it. And so I'm applying whatever I think this group of people is like to every person that I meet from that group of people. So let's watch a quick video from the great social commentary source, The Office. Sorry.
Oh my God. Pick up. We have a serious problem here.
All right, everybody, lock the doors, turn off the lights, pretend you're not here.
Are we in danger?
There's no time to think about if this is real. Just, shh, everybody.
Michael, should I call the... What?
The IT tech guy and me did not get off to a great start. Kelly, you are Hindu, so you believe in Buddha.
That's Buddhist.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
What are you?
Well, if you're going to reduce my identity to my religion, then I'm Sikh. But I also like hip-hop and NPR.
Catch it up.
And I'm restoring a 1967 Corvette in my spare time.
Okay. So one Sikh, and...
Okay. So talk to me about Michael. What are some of the problems that he's facing? Go ahead, Nick.
it seemed pretty clear that he had some stereotype for an IT tech, and it didn't have anything to do with the outward cultural signifiers of I want to say turban, whatever that is called. I apologize for not knowing that. But yeah, he immediately associated that the IT tech guy who's coming in is going to look like somebody else, some other characteristics. And when that wasn't the case, he immediately freaked out with his other stereotype of what are people with turbans, maybe somebody who's going to attack us, right?
Great. In Scranton, Pennsylvania.
In Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Office complex, yeah. Other things, anything else that stood out to you in that short clip?
One thing that I found very interesting was the way that he questioned the woman about Hindus believing in Buddha. Like, are you sure?
Yeah.
Questioning her own cultural identity.
Yeah, great. And Sadiq, the IT guy, talking about his response, what he had to say and how it was valued or wasn't valued.
Just like he started to explain how he was so much more, and there was so much more to him that he liked to do, that he was interested in. But I think it's easy for us to like get an idea of someone in our heads, and then we just kind of like blank everything else out and don't listen to them, just think, oh, they're this.
Great, thank you. So a couple of principles here that I think are important. Let's look briefly at your self-descriptors you provided at the beginning. So we have a lot of people defining themselves as students. A lot of folks saying teachers, tall, or short, Arabic, Filipino. I don't see race represented here much at all. Why do you think that might be? Esther and then Stacy.
I mean, I think it's just not that relevant. If you're meeting someone for the first time, like, the first thing I want you to know about me is I'm white, okay? Like, let's just take that into consideration, you know, like, it's really not that relevant.
Okay. Okay, go ahead, Stacy.
I think it's not that relevant for people who are white.
Great, thank you. So I think that like when I'm filling out something like this, I have that thought, like, white is not central to my identity, so I don't feel like it's necessary for me to say that. But is that because I'm white and I live in a white-dominated society, right? So one of the greatest, like most insightful conversations I had in this regard was with an African-American student in a multiculturalism class, and we were talking about this specific issue, and he said, well, you don't wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and think, well, I'm a white guy going out to do white things, because when you walk into a grocery store, people don't look at you odd. They don't watch you to make sure you're not stealing stuff. Whereas with me, he was African American, my race is central to my day-to-day activities. And so it is central to my identity. And so in many ways, how we structure our identities and even think about ourselves are a byproduct of where we live and the power structures surrounding us. Come on, buddy. So people are complex, you know, as Sadiq tried to point out to Michael. We're self-defining. We resist attempts at self-reducing us, of self-reductionism. Like, even like with me, so my religion is very central to my identity. I consider myself a Latter-day Saint. That's pretty high up there in terms of like how I identify myself. But I also don't think of myself as just a Latter-day Saint. And it's not like a criticism of being a Latter-day Saint or anything like that, but just that there are other aspects of my identity that extend outside of being a Latter-day Saint. Does that make sense? And so if I'm talking with someone and they are viewing me as just a Latter-day Saint, that's problematic to me. And it applies to race, it applies to culture, and so forth. And we value the ability to define ourselves. We also need to understand that identity is both individual and communal. And again, this is influenced by our culture. So in the West, we experience what many call hyper-individualism, where our emphasis on identity is very focused on an individual, on our identity as an individual versus our identity as part of a community. But that varies based upon our cultural upbringing. So, for instance, African Americans in the United States have a much stronger kind of communal identity than I do, than many of us do. And we need to recognize that identity is not just an individual identification and de-identification, but it's also communal. Then also we assume homogeneity. Part of, if I'm talking to someone and I can't see them, I'm going to assume that they're like me unless I have reasons to think otherwise. So I do a lot of Twitter research, and you see this in research in social media where people don't identify with their religions because, like, Christians in predominantly Christian areas, for instance, don't say that they're Christian just because they assume everybody's Christian. So if everybody's Christian, then I'm not going to identify that way. Same with Latter-day Saints in Utah. We don't put that front and center in our identity because we just assume everyone is. This happens at BYU. If you've ever been in a class where the instructor assumed that people in the room were Republican, if you're a Democrat in that situation like that, that can be very problematic. Or like, if you go to another university, it's assumed that everyone in the class is a Democrat, which if you're a Republican, that can be very problematic as well. But so we assume homogeneity unless we have reasons to think otherwise. And we apply this in a lot of ways. Let's watch another great social commentary from King of the Hill. In this, Hank has a new neighbor, Con, and he's trying to understand Con's cultural background.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
I live in California last 20 years, but first come from Laos.
Huh?
Laos. We Laotian.
The ocean? What ocean?
We are Laotian. From Laos, stupid. It's a landlocked country in Southeast Asia. It's between Vietnam and Thailand, okay? Population 4.7 million.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
Oh.
All right, talk to me about this. What's Hank struggling with? Yeah, your name. Okay. What's going on in Hank's mind?
I don't have my phone, but you know, you have similarities, some broad similarities, maybe in how he looks, and he's just associating that general look with Asia. And that seems like his struggles, he can't break it down.
Yeah. And I think part of that too is that as he thinks about Asia, there are only two parts of Asia. There's China and Japan. You're one or the other. There is no other complexity to it. Great. So stereotypes we mentioned. Sorry, I'm going to have to start moving faster. Stereotypes and labels. We assume that, or we have come as a society to agree that stereotyping folks is immoral and it's often illegal. So, yeah, I don't have time to jump into this, but like say you're on a hiring committee and you have someone applying for a job from Estonia, and and English is not their primary language. And you're sitting in the hiring committee and you think, well, you know, the last 3 people we hired who were not native English speakers had difficulty learning the technical jargon that we use. Therefore, I'm going to use that prior knowledge to say this person probably isn't a good fit. Is that okay to do?
Not with Estonia.
What?
Not with Estonia. Specifically, they have a really high rates of English.
Okay, great.
High technical skills.
Yeah, they do. It's actually illegal because even if it's based on your previous experience, you're still stereotyping people. And so stereotypes are often created out of personal experiences. I have interactions with 1 or 2 or 3 people, and I have an experience of this kind of person being this way, but it's not okay to then apply that to a larger group. And the last basic principle here is that history matters. And a lot of times when we approach problems, we try to assume that, you know, we're seeing this this thing for the first time, for instance. So say if you're an alien and you were come to Earth today and you're trying to solve some of the problems we face in the US, you said, well, here's a great idea. Why don't we just separate folks by race and make sure everyone's equal? That would be problematic, right? Because we have a history of segregation and inequality that arises out of segregation. So even in the words that we use, So like the word colored, for instance, is not an appropriate term to use because it is a term of segregation. We don't refer to people, and we should not refer to someone as a colored person because that was historically used as a form of othering someone else, othering people. Oh, sorry, and this last one. So you probably don't know what it's like, and this is important to understand. So I have a picture here of the Mormon Trail. So we went on trek this last year, and that was a great experience where we went to Martin's Cove. We got to appreciate, some of, or just celebrate what some of the folks went through when they were making the trek across the Great Plains. But if someone went on trek and then came home and said, I really understand what it was like for those pioneers to cross the plains, that'd be problematic, right? Because yes, they kind of experienced it a little bit, but they don't know what it's like to bury a child in a shallow grave. In the same way, we take our own experiences and sometimes assume that they qualify us to understand what someone else is experiencing. So like, if, for instance, I've experienced marginalization because of my religion, I might turn around and say, well, therefore I understand what it's like to be black in America. And I don't. Now, that might put me in a position to have some sympathy for an African American and the racial experiences that they have, but it doesn't put me in a place of empathizing with them and knowing I can't put my arm around them and say, I know what it's like, I'm just like you. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's some concrete guidance. One of the problems we run into in our field is that we start off with this assumption that we need to identify an average learner, or this learner right here in the middle, and that is the person we are designing for. I think that's a faulty assumption for a lot of different reasons. I don't think we need to just design for one learner, but it creates all kinds of problems when we take all these things into consideration, because if I'm imagining that learner, who am I imagining? Typically me. I'm designing for myself. I'm not designing for the actual people that are using my stuff. So we need to assume a diverse audience, so in terms of race, culture, nation of origin, socioeconomic level, educational background, and so forth. We need to assume that our users of our content, or that our students, are different. If you saw this question on a standardized test, how many of you think you could get it right? Esther, you think you could?
I think so.
Stacy? I just made this up. Like, this is a nonsense question. I just went to a British glossary of British terms that aren't used in America. But if I made a question on a test that really reflected my white culture, even if someone knows English really well, that would be problematic. I remember when I was a kid, I lived in a very poor rural area of Texas. I remember going to state conference and listening to our state leaders talk and just hearing golf reference after golf reference after golf reference and thinking, I don't know anyone that plays golf. That's a rich person's sport. I'm never going to play golf. I don't understand golf. Why are you making these? And just thinking, this person doesn't understand me at all. But we do this, and we fall into this trap a lot when we are designing curriculum. We assume that people that we're designing our content for, just because we have a common language, they're going to understand the cultural implications of the questions that I'm asking and how I'm approaching problems. We need to seek for diverse teams, so we should value diversity in input, skills, and experiences without tokenizing team members. So I need to recognize that I don't have all the answers, and I can't figure out how to design for everybody, so I need to include other people in this process. But I need to do this in a way that doesn't tokenize people. And this is a negative term. We don't want to tokenize people. And to illustrate this, Esther, can I use you as an example? So Esther, say we're working at the same company, and I say, Esther, I'm on this hiring committee, but we need the women's perspective, so will you come be on this committee with me? So that's one approach. Another approach would be, Esther, would you come be on this committee with me? I really value your perspective, and especially I value your perspective as a woman. What are the differences between those two approaches? Or do you see a difference between those two?
Well, Kristen.
Oh, no.
Well, in the first one, I see that because I'm a woman, it sounds like I will have the woman's perspective, that there is only one, and then that I know it, and that would be some sort of authoritative source. Whereas in the second one,
more sort of holistic.
Great, awesome. So Esther said, could you hear her in the back?
Not very well.
Okay.
I also have a response. I don't know how similar it is.
But so part of it is in the first, I'm assuming that she's the authority on women, and I'm expecting her to be a vocal piece for all women, which she probably doesn't want to do. She doesn't want that role, I wouldn't think. But that puts her in an awkward position. Maku, did you have something?
Yeah, like I said, I couldn't hear it very well, so some of this might be a repeat. But like, I feel like the first one, it almost sounds like you're expressing, I'm only asking you to be on this committee because I have to. Whereas the second one sounds more like, I genuinely would value your input because it would be different than mine, and I want to hear what it would be.
Great, awesome, thank you. We need to listen and seek to understand. Again, this is based on the assumption that we don't understand. And the only way that we can understand is by really listening to people and hearing what they have to say, not applying these labels and assumptions that we already have about them, not pulling a Hank Hill and saying, well, you're either Chinese or Japanese, but listening to, oh, I didn't realize there were other Asian cultures other than Chinese and Japanese. And really listening to people's experiences. We need to provide authentic voices in our content, so we need to represent folks in their own words, representing their own values and representing their best selves. So if I'm creating a narrative or a vignette in my materials about immigrant families, I need to represent them in a way that they would appreciate, in a way that they would believe actually does represent them. We need to question issues of access and opportunity. So I mean, you hear this kind of thing a lot. It was on the website, so everyone had the same access to it. That's very problematic because not everyone has Wi-Fi or data plan, and even those who do often don't have the same types of devices. And the type of device may impact their ability to access content. Be thoughtful about the visuals, names, and stories that we use. So I mean, the example that's often used for this is that if you close your eyes and I want you to imagine a scientist or a physician, like, who do you imagine? And like, this has come up a lot like in STEM education, or when we're teaching girls. We've trained them through years and years of media that scientists are men, that doctors are men, and that they're white. And so as a student, if I'm looking at content, is that content reaffirming that stereotype, or is it problematizing it a little bit? I don't have time for that, we need to provide representation without tokenism, reductionism, or stereotyping. So if I'm creating an open textbook, I need to include images that represent a diversity of people. It needs to be additive and not subtractive. This comes up a lot in second language learning and among English language learners. Because you could, like, say you have students that come into your class, their home language is Spanish. One way to approach working with those students is to say, don't speak Spanish in this class. We don't value that. That is not what makes you American. That is a very subtractive approach because you are assuming that has no value. But does it have value to know Spanish? I wish I knew Spanish. I don't know Spanish. I took 3 years of Spanish and I can't speak any Spanish. Versus an additive approach values what they bring into the classroom with them and builds upon it. You speak Spanish, let's build upon that. Why don't you help teach us Spanish as well as we're learning about these concepts together? We need to recognize the interaction between power, language, and pedagogy. So this comes up a lot. A simple example of this is with international students. So we have students that come to our universities, for instance, who have been taught in schools that are very different from our universities. They've been taught in schools where everything is lecture. And so now we put them in a group and we expect them to have a discussion or to ask me questions as the instructor when they've been taught that in some countries that women don't talk to men or you never talk to your instructor. That's a problematic situation to be in. And so if I'm creating a course and I say, well, let's just do group discussion in this course, I have to think about what are the cultural assumptions that my students are bringing with them and how do I scaffold them to help them develop the ability to even participate in conversation and to be comfortable doing that. Descriptors matter, so the terms that we use matter. Again, this gets back to the history. Sorry, I'm just flying through things, but I just have a couple more slides that I want to hit. I think sometimes, as a white person, the response when we're faced with multiculturalism is to kind of say that I'm trying to be colorblind. I want to just assume that I don't judge people by the color of the skin. I don't even see race. And you hear people say that kind of thing sometimes. What's the problem with that? Well, it's dishonest, first of all. But go ahead.
I think we talked earlier about what elements are important to our identity and what are not.
Mm-hmm.
When you say you're colorblind, like a person who the first thing they define themselves as, I'm a member of this ethnicity or this race and it's really important to me,
Yeah.
it just totally discounts how important that matters to them.
Great.
So you have to, rather than like pretending it doesn't exist, you have to value it and talk about how it's important and useful and you can work together.
Great, awesome. So it discounts what's of value to them, and it's also dishonest because we see the color of people's skins, right? I mean, the similar thing might be say like, I'm gender blind. I don't notice. Those of you all here, I don't notice if you're a man or a woman. Like, if I was talking to you as a student and then you started telling me about how your experience as a mother was difficult, I say, oh, I never realized you were a woman. How would you respond to that? Would you praise me for my inclusivity, for not judging you based upon gender? No. So I think that we have to understand that we have to own this kind of recognition that we do see race, and we need to value it rather than try to ignore it. And we need to do a self-analysis about our own privileges and biases. So the last thing that I want to share with you is this picture. What is this picture of? Last Supper. What is your reaction? Like, you don't have to say, what is your like internal reaction to this picture? Is this the same as other Last Supper paintings that you've seen? I think I bring this up because the paintings that we see of the Last Supper, do you think they're actually accurate for what it was like? What was Christ's race? What was the color of his skin? I don't know, but I'm assuming it probably wasn't as white as mine. So when I see an image of Christ that is depicted as a Nordic person, what is my reaction to that versus what is my reaction to this? Am I reacting in the same way? And I ask that because I think, and I use this as an example, because Christ and his apostles gave us, I think, a pretty good model to follow here in how we approach issues of multiculturalism. If you remember at the Last Supper, Christ is talking to his apostles and he tells them, one of you are going to betray me. It says, they were exceedingly sorrowful and began every one of them to say unto him, Lord, is it I? I think that's very profound. It tells us a lot about the apostles. So I put myself in their shoes. If I was Simon Peter, I probably had a decent livelihood, I was fishing, and Christ comes along and tells me to follow him. I leave my livelihood, I follow in his footsteps for years in poverty, I sacrifice everything, I'm not with my family, and now I'm sitting with Christ at this Last Supper, and he's accusing me, potentially, I could view it this way, accusing me of something that I haven't even done. He's telling me I'm going to potentially do something. And so I could see it being in the apostles' shoes and saying, and being kind of offended by that. Like, why would you even assume this? Look at all that I've given up for you. Look at the life that I've been leading. But they were very humble in this, and it says they were sorrowful. And each of them started to ask, is it me? And so I think that's the right attitude to have when we're approaching questions of multiculturalism. It's that rather than becoming defensive or being offended, we need to just humbly ask ourselves, is it me, or what more should I be doing in this regard? And that's all I have to share with you. So I don't think we have time for questions, but I'd love to answer any questions or talk more about these things afterwards. But I don't know, Jason, I'm assuming we're out of time.